The room was thick with the scent of lilies and false grief. My uncle Robert stood at the front, dabbing at his dry eyes with a pristine white handkerchief. He had just finished a lengthy, heartfelt speech about his beloved sister, my mother. He spoke of her kindness, her gentleness, and the profound void her passing had left. He painted a picture of himself and my Aunt Carol as her devoted caretakers, the pillars of strength who had supported her through her final, difficult years. The small crowd of family friends and distant relatives, gathered in the function room of a local restaurant for her memorial, murmured in sympathy. A few of them even clapped softly. From my position near the back wall, I watched the performance with a cold, settled calm. My brother David sat at the front table, nodding along with a solemn expression he had perfected over a lifetime of getting what he wanted. As the applause died down, I pushed myself off the wall and began to walk toward the front. The sound of my leather shoes on the polished floor was the only noise in the suddenly quiet room. Every eye turned to me. I could feel their judgment. I was the prodigal son, the one who had been absent for 15 years, now returned to disrupt their carefully managed narrative. I reached the small podium, moving Robert gently to the side. I looked out at the crowd, my gaze finally settling on my aunt and uncle. "That was a beautiful story," I began, my voice even and clear. "A masterpiece of fiction. But my mother's real last words weren't about your devotion. They were about your betrayal." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Aunt Carol's face, a mask of sorrow a moment ago, hardened into a scowl. My brother shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "For 40 years you told a story about our family," I continued, my voice dropping slightly, drawing them in. "A story where I was the problem, the disappointment, and you were the saints. You thought that with my mother gone, your version of the truth was the only one left." I paused, letting the weight of my words hang in the air. "You never counted on me cleaning out the attic. How does a family get to a place like this? It doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow poison, administered in small, daily doses. To understand what was in that box, you have to understand the family I grew up in. Our father died when I was 10, and my brother, David, was 8. His absence created a vacuum that my mother, lost in her own grief, allowed her sister Carol and her husband Robert to fill. And they were more than happy to step in and manage our lives. From that point on, our home operated on a simple, unspoken rule. David was the sun, and I was the shadow he cast. David was charming, loud, and careless. He broke windows with baseballs, failed classes with a shrug, and could charm his way out of any trouble. In the eyes of our mother, and especially our aunt and uncle, his recklessness was spirit, and his failures were just boys being boys. I was the opposite. I was quiet, responsible, and introspective. I got good grades, did my chores without being asked, and tried my best to not cause any trouble for our grieving mother. But my quiet nature was interpreted as sullen. My responsibility was not praised. It was simply expected. My diligence was boring. I remember when I was 12, David knocked over a porcelain vase, a wedding gift our mother cherished. He immediately burst into tears and pointed at me. Before I could even speak, Aunt Carol was there, telling my mother, "See? Liam is always trying to get his brother into trouble. He's jealous." I was grounded for a month. The truth didn't matter. The narrative had already been written. David was the golden child who could do no wrong, and I was the resentful older brother, the convenient scapegoat for every problem. This dynamic hardened over the years. David's allowance was twice mine because he had more friends and needed it. When he wanted a new bike for his birthday, I was told to give him the money I'd been saving from my paper route because family helps family. My sacrifices were never seen as sacrifices. They were my duty. My achievements were footnotes in the grand story of David's potential. Carol and Robert were the narrators of this story, constantly whispering in my mother's ear, reinforcing the roles they had assigned to us. My mother, weak and eager to avoid conflict, accepted their version of reality. It was easier than fighting them. It was easier than seeing the truth. The breaking point came the summer after I graduated from high school. For 4 years, I had worked every weekend and every summer at a greasy spoon diner on the edge of town. I washed dishes, bussed tables, and mopped floors, saving every single dollar I could. I had a small, tattered bank book where I tracked my earnings, watching the numbers slowly climb. That money wasn't for a car or for clothes. It was my escape route. It was my tuition for the state college, my ticket to a life where my worth wasn't determined by my brother's needs. I had saved just over $5,000. It was everything to me. One evening, I came home to find my mother, aunt, and uncle sitting at the kitchen table with solemn faces. David was nowhere to be seen. Uncle Robert cleared his throat and began a long, convoluted story about David borrowing a friend's car, a misunderstanding with another driver, and some minor damage. The bottom line was that David had caused a fender bender and promised the other driver he'd pay for the repairs in cash to avoid insurance. The cost was $2,000. I listened, waiting for the other shoe to drop. "He's learned his lesson," Aunt Carol said, looking at me pointedly. "What's important now is that we handle this as a family." "Okay," I said slowly. "So David needs to get a job and pay for it." Robert scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous, Liam. Your brother is starting community college in the fall. He needs to focus on his studies." He slid my tattered bank book across the table. It was open. I saw the withdrawal slip tucked inside. $2,000. Gone. My mother wouldn't look at me. She just stared at her hands, clasped tightly on the table. "You took my money?" I whispered, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. "We didn't take it," Carol corrected, her voice sharp and righteous. "We used it to protect your brother. That's what family does. You're strong, Liam. You can earn it back. This would have crushed David." In that moment, everything became crystal clear. I wasn't their son or their nephew. I was a resource, a utility, an emergency fund to be depleted for the sake of their real family project. David. The injustice of it all was so absolute, so suffocating I couldn't even shout. A cold calm washed over me. I stood up from the table, picked up my useless bank book, and walked to my room. I packed a small bag with a few changes of clothes. I didn't take anything they had ever given me. As I walked past the kitchen, my mother finally looked up, her eyes pleading. "Liam, please," she started. I looked at her, at my aunt, at my uncle. "You didn't just take my money," I said, my voice devoid of all emotion. "You took the last reason I had to stay." I walked out the front door and never looked back. The first few months were the hardest of my life. I had less than $50 in my pocket. I slept on park benches and in bus stations, eating whatever I could afford, which was usually very little. The cold fury that had propelled me out of that house slowly gave way to a gnawing despair. Their voices echoed in my head. Aunt Carol calling me selfish, my mother pleading, Uncle Robert's dismissive scoff. They had told me I was nothing without them, and for a few desperate weeks, I started to believe it. I was adrift, a ghost haunting the edges of a world that didn't seem to have a place for me. One rainy afternoon, huddled under an awning, I watched a young man in a crisp uniform walk into a recruitment office. He walked with a purpose and a straight-backed confidence I couldn't even imagine feeling. On a sudden impulse, with nothing left to lose, I followed him inside. It was the single best decision I ever made. The Army didn't care about my family drama or who my brother was. They cared about 3 things. Could I follow orders? Could I learn? And could I endure? I could do all 3. For the first time in my life, I was in an environment where the rules were clear and effort was rewarded. My quiet nature was seen as discipline. My diligence was recognized as a strength. I didn't just endure, I excelled. I poured all the pain and anger from my past into fuel for my future. I took every course they offered, earned a degree in logistics and management on the military's dime, and climbed the ranks faster than anyone expected. I served for 12 years, leaving with the rank of captain and a commendation for my service. Using the discipline and strategic skills I'd honed, I entered the private sector. I started a small logistics consulting firm with a fellow veteran. We worked 18-hour days, fueled by coffee and a shared determination to build something of our own. That small firm grew. Within 10 years, it was one of the most respected supply chain management companies in the country, with major international contracts. I wasn't just a success. I was wealthy and in command of my own destiny. During all those years, I never once reached out to my family. I changed my number and moved several times. I built a new family, one of friends and colleagues who respected me. I had finally become the man my family never believed I could be, all without them. For 15 years, my past was a locked room in my mind. I had the key, but I never had a reason to open the door. That changed on a Tuesday morning. An email arrived in my inbox, forwarded by my assistant. It was from a cousin I hadn't spoken to since childhood, with the subject line, "Sad news about your mom." My mother had passed away after a long illness. The funeral was in 3 days. I stared at the words on the screen, feeling a strange and hollow ache. I wasn't grieving for the woman who stood by and let her son's future be stolen. I was grieving for the mother who read me bedtime stories, who bandaged my scraped knees, the one who existed before my father died and her siblings sank their claws into her. It was that memory, faint as it was, that made my decision. I had to go back, not for them, but for her, and for the boy who had walked out of that house with nothing. I flew into the small regional airport, rented a nondescript sedan, and drove into the town that I'd fled so many years ago. It looked smaller, sadder. I attended the funeral, sitting in the back pew of the church. An anonymous figure in a well-tailored black suit. I watched David, now puffy and middle-aged, deliver a stilted eulogy. I watched Aunt Carol and Uncle Robert play the part of the bereaved, dutiful siblings. After the service, at the small, awkward gathering at the church hall, they finally noticed me. Aunt Carol's eyes widened, and a flicker of something, not happiness but alarm, crossed her face. Uncle Robert approached me, his expression a mixture of suspicion and disdain. Well, he said, his voice low. Look who decided to grace us with his presence. A little late, don't you think? I'm here to pay my respects, Robert, I said, my voice steady. My calmness seemed to unnerve him. Right, your respects, he sneered. Don't think you can just show up after 15 years and expect to get anything. Your mother knew who was there for her. Everything is being taken care of. Later, I overheard him talking to David near the sad-looking buffet table. The lawyer said it's straightforward, Robert muttered. The house, the savings, it all goes to you, Davy. It's what she would have wanted. We just have to get him out of town before he tries to make things difficult. They still saw me as the same powerless boy, a problem to be managed. They had no idea that I wasn't there for a handout. I was there for the truth. The day after the funeral, David and my aunt cornered me in the living room of my mother's house. It was a place frozen in time, with the same faded floral sofa and the same scent of old paper and polish. Since you're here, you might as well make yourself useful, Carol said, her tone leaving no room for argument. David has to handle the arrangements. The least you can do is start cleaning this place out, starting with the attic. It was a dismissal, a chore meant to isolate me with the dust and the ghosts of the past while they dealt with the important business of the estate. It was also the biggest mistake they could have made. I agreed without a word and headed for the narrow staircase at the end of the hall. Each step creaked under my weight, a familiar protest from a house that held no good memories for me. Pushing open the attic door released a wave of thick, stagnant air. A single grimy window at the far end let in a sliver of gray light, illuminating swirling dust motes. The place was a tomb of forgotten things. Broken furniture, stacks of old magazines, holiday decorations, and clothes that had long gone out of style. This was my mother's entire life, packed away and left to decay. I spent hours methodically sorting, bagging, and clearing. It was emotionally draining work. Every object seemed to tell a story of neglect, not just of things, but of a life. As I cleared a space in the far corner, my foot caught on a floorboard. It was loose. I knelt, thinking it was just another sign of the house's disrepair. But when I ran my hand over it, I could feel that the edges were different, smoother, as if it had been lifted many times. My heart began to beat a little faster. I found a crowbar in an old toolbox and carefully pried the board up. Beneath it, nestled in the dark space between the joists, was a metal box. It was an old, heavy, army green footlocker, the kind soldiers used decades ago. It was sealed shut with a rusty padlock. It hadn't been tossed here randomly. It had been deliberately concealed. A cold certainty washed over me. This was no box of forgotten Christmas ornaments. This was a secret. I felt a tremor of anticipation, a feeling that I was on the verge of understanding everything. I carried the heavy box down from the heat of the attic, took it to the solitude of my rental car, and drove to the nearest hardware store to buy a pair of bolt cutters. I sat in the passenger seat of my rental car in the quiet corner of a nearly empty parking lot. The bolt cutters felt heavy and purposeful in my hands. With a sharp crack, the old padlock broke apart. I lifted the heavy lid of the footlocker, and a faint, musty smell of paper and regret filled the car. Inside, everything was neatly organized. On top was a thick stack of envelopes, bound with a faded ribbon. They were all addressed to me, in my mother's familiar, looping handwriting. Beneath them lay several thick, leather-bound journals and a large manila folder bulging with official-looking documents. My hands trembled as I untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. The date was from the week after I left. "My dearest Liam," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I was too much of a coward to ever send them. And it means you have found this box, my only confession. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." I read for over an hour, letter after letter, journal entry after journal entry. The truth, in all its ugly detail, spilled out onto the pages. My mother wasn't a willing participant in my family's cruelty. She was its first victim. After my father died, Carol and Robert had systematically taken control of her life. They told her she was incapable of managing her own finances, of raising 2 boys alone. They fostered her dependence until it became absolute. They portrayed me as cold and difficult to drive a wedge between us, making her feel that my love was conditional while theirs was absolute. They isolated her from friends, telling her that people were gossiping about her. The journals were filled with her pain and self-loathing. Carol said Liam was just being selfish about the college money. One entry read, "She said he didn't love me or David. I know it's not true, but what do I do? They said they would leave me all alone if I didn't listen." And then came the financial documents. Bank statements showing thousands of dollars being transferred from my mother's savings to Robert's company under the guise of loans for David that were never repaid. Papers detailing how they had mortgaged the house without her fully understanding the terms, siphoning the equity for themselves. It was a meticulous, decades-long campaign of emotional abuse and financial fraud. Tears streamed down my face. They were tears of grief for the mother I never truly knew, and for the life she had been forced to live. But beneath the grief, a new feeling was taking root. A cold, hard, and diamond-sharp rage. They hadn't just stolen my college fund. They had stolen my mother. And now, they were going to pay for it. I carefully placed my mother's letters and journals back into the footlocker, closing the lid. The grief was still there, a heavy weight in my chest, but it was now encased in ice. My mission was no longer a vague notion of confronting them. It was a precise tactical objective. I would not just expose them. I would dismantle their entire world, piece by piece, using the very evidence my mother had left me. The boy they had cast out was gone. In his place was a man who commanded resources, who understood strategy, and who was about to bring the full weight of his success crashing down upon them. Back in my hotel room, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a man named Arthur Vance, the sharpest forensic accountant my company had ever employed. I explained the situation in cold, professional terms. I told him I was overnighting him a package of documents and that I needed a complete, irrefutable audit of 2 decades of financial abuse. The second call was to a private investigation firm I had used for corporate due diligence. I tasked them with a full background check on Robert and Carol and a lifestyle audit. I wanted to know where every stolen dollar had gone. The results came back within a week, and they were even worse than I had imagined. Arthur's report was a brutal 50-page document detailing over $400,000 in siphoned funds, fraudulent loans, and outright theft, complete with charts and timelines. The private investigator's report was the narrative that went with the numbers. It showed the new cars Robert bought, the luxury cruises Carol took, the seed money for their own failing business that had come directly from my mother's accounts. They had been living a comfortable upper-middle-class life entirely funded by their systematic abuse of a grieving widow. David, my brother, had been the recipient of some of the cash, but the lion's share had been funneled directly to my aunt and uncle. The PI's report also contained a golden nugget of information. My cousin had forwarded an invitation, in an act of supreme arrogance. To cement their status as pillars of the community and devoted family members, Robert and Carol were hosting a formal memorial dinner in my mother's honor at the town's nicest restaurant. They had invited everyone. It was meant to be their victory lap. Instead, it would be their execution. I had my evidence, I had my team, and now I had my venue. I called the restaurant's event manager, posing as a representative for the family, and arranged to have a projector and screen set up for a tribute video. The trap was set. The restaurant was exactly as the investigator had described. Tastefully decorated, filled with soft lighting and the hushed conversations of about 50 guests. I stood at the back, just as I had at the funeral, a silent observer in a sea of polite deception. Aunt Carol, dressed in expensive black, moved between tables, accepting condolences with a practiced, sorrowful smile. Uncle Robert stood by the podium, preparing to begin the evening's main event, the public canonization of himself. After a few minutes, he tapped the microphone. "Friends, family," he began, his voice resonating with false humility. "Thank you all for coming to honor the memory of a truly wonderful woman, my sister." He launched into the speech I'd watched him rehearse, a tribute not to my mother, but to his own supposed virtue. He spoke of late-night calls, of financial burdens shouldered without complaint, and of the heartbreak of watching her decline. He subtly painted me as a footnote, the son who chose a different path, leaving the real work to those who truly loved her. He ended with his eyes turned upward, as if speaking to the heavens. "We miss you, Eleanor. We did our best for you." The room filled with respectful applause. My brother David, looking emotional, even stood to hug him. This was their moment of triumph, the final scene of the play they had been performing for decades. And it was my cue. I pushed myself off the wall and walked to the front, my steps echoing in the sudden silence. I took the microphone from Robert's hand. "That was a beautiful story," I said, my voice cutting through the warm atmosphere like a shard of ice. "A masterpiece of fiction, but my mother's real last words weren't about your devotion. They were about your betrayal." Before anyone could react, I clicked a remote in my hand. The projector screen behind me, which they assumed was for a slideshow of old photos, flickered to life. It didn't show my mother's smiling face. It showed a page from her journal, the handwriting shaky but clear. Robert and Carol control everything. I read aloud, my voice ringing with a terrible clarity. I feel like a prisoner in my own home. They tell me Liam doesn't love me. God forgive me. I know it's a lie. A wave of shock rolled through the crowd. I clicked the remote again. An image of a bank statement appeared on the screen, a transfer of $10,000 to a corporate account highlighted in red. "And here," I said, my gaze fixed on my uncle, whose face had gone chalk white, "is the financial burden you shouldered. A transfer from my mother's life savings to your failing company 1 week before you declared a miraculous profit. My mother called this the money for David's future. You called it an investment." I kept clicking, slide after slide. Forged loan documents, lavish vacation receipts, a meticulous, undeniable timeline of their greed. The whispers in the room grew into a roar of outrage. The performance was over. The room erupted into chaos. Aunt Carol began screaming, a shrill, panicked sound. "Lies! He's lying! He was always a hateful child." Uncle Robert lunged for the podium, his face a grotesque mask of fury and fear, trying to shut off the projector. But it was too late. The guests were backing away from them, their faces filled with disgust. Former friends who had just been shaking their hands now looked at them as if they were monsters. My brother, David, just sat at his table, his head in his hands, sobbing. He wasn't a villain. He was just a weak man who had happily lived on the proceeds of cruelty, and now his comfortable world had evaporated before his eyes. "You think you can get away with this?" Robert bellowed at me, his voice cracking. "They already know," I said calmly, nodding towards the entrance of the restaurant. As if on cue, 2 uniformed police officers walked in, followed by a plainclothes detective. The detective held a thick folder in his hand, a copy of the one I had given him 2 days earlier. He walked past the stunned guests, his eyes locked on my aunt and uncle. "Robert and Carol Sterling?" the detective said, his voice cutting through the noise. "You need to come with us. We have a warrant to arrest you on charges of fraud and financial elder abuse." The sight of the handcuffs being clicked onto their wrists was the final devastating blow. The public humiliation was absolute. As they were being led away, Carol shot me a look of pure, undiluted hatred. It didn't touch me. I felt nothing but a quiet, solemn finality. I turned back to the microphone one last time. "My mother's real will wasn't the one they filed with their lawyer," I announced to the silent room. "The real one was in the box she hid from them. In it, she left everything to me, with one instruction: to make things right." I looked around at the faces staring at me. I will be selling the house and all of my mother's assets. Every single cent will be donated to a national charity that protects the elderly from financial predators like them. I placed the microphone back on the stand. I glanced at David, a broken man who had just lost everything. I felt no triumph, only a vast, empty peace. My duty was done. I had cleared my name, but more importantly, I had given my mother's memory the justice she had been too afraid to seek for herself. I turned my back on the wreckage of my family and walked out of the restaurant, leaving the ghosts of the past behind me for good. I was finally free,